welcome to this talk, which is our April talk in our Social Sciences Occasional Lectures. So, I am very happy to be able to introduce to you today our speaker, who is Sarah Blum, and she's a lecturer here at Mesa College in History. And she is, if you notice the topic of her talk, which is No Paradise of Tolerance, School Desegregation and the Legacy of Housing Discrimination in Louisville, Kentucky, 1950 to the present. You will notice that it focuses on Kentucky, which is no coincidence because our speaker is from Kentucky, and she did her graduate work at the University of Kentucky. And the talk that we're going to hear here is actually going to be part of a talk that she's preparing for the Southern Historical Association's meeting in New Orleans in November this year.
Thank you guys so much for coming on a lovely Friday afternoon in San Diego. Before I actually begin the talk today, I want to kind of get you oriented with Louisville, which is Louisville, to you guys. Because my guess is y'all don't think about it nearly as much as I think about it. So obviously Kentucky is the red state. There is no coincidence that it is red. It's very politically red these days. Here's Louisville. It's kind of hard to see here, but Louisville is actually located right along the Ohio River, across the border from Indiana. And Louisville's location really benefits it throughout the 19th century that makes Louisville become the largest city in the state. That's the reason that I chose to write about it. This is a very large, detailed map of the city. And for my purposes today, we're going to be primarily talking about this part of the city, which is known as the West End, which is mostly where African Americans are living in the mid-20th century and remain largely concentrated today. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is how, in the wake of the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, one African American family, he's actually a World War II veteran, tries to move his home from this area into this area, which is out sort of in the county, okay? So sort of this juxtaposition between housing integration and school integration all at the same time. Just to give you some idea of what the makeup of the city is in 1950, it's roughly around, close to 400,000 folks are living there. Most of them are white. The rest of them are largely African American, roughly around 60,000. Just to give you an idea of where African Americans are living during this period, this is the central part of the city. In the 1960s, this is where the Interstate 65 will cut through, move most of these people even further into this area, and then we have a fairly large concentration of African Americans here. Now, the West End becomes the prescribed African American area of the city, largely for environmental reasons. Sitting along the Ohio River, it is an environmental floodplain. And also, after World War II, we have defense industries that are constructed here, and most of the pollutants are moving up here. Okay? So, another one. This is just pretty much the same idea, just to give you an idea that African Americans are largely concentrated in these central parts of the area. This is the couple that I'm going to be talking about today, Andrew and Charlotte Wade. Now, in 1954, after the Supreme Court declared segregated schools unconstitutional in the landmark decision Brown versus Board of Education, the school board in Louisville quickly went about the task of implementing the court's decision. William Embry, who was the city school board president, told reporters, quote, "Our thinking and planning must start right now, even if the decision allows us 5 years to carry out desegregation." The board members and local leaders, ever mindful of the city's reputation for racial and economic progress, heeded Embry's call to action. They held informational meetings for the parents, integrated teacher training, and distributed copies of the desegregation plan to the community. 2 years later, on September 10, 1956, Louisville becomes the first southern city to peacefully comply with Brown. At a press conference the day after the schools opened, President Dwight Eisenhower celebrated the city's successful transition to racially integrated classrooms, asked about the behavior of Texas Rangers in Texarkana, Texas, in refusing to allow African Americans to enter schools in which they had registered. Eisenhower told the group of reporters, quote, "It contrasts very badly with what happened in Louisville, where there had not been the slightest trouble." According to the president, school superintendent Omer Carmichael had successfully prepared the willing community for school integration. Eisenhower remarked, "Carmichael must be a very wise man. I hope to meet him and get some advice from him as to exactly how he did it." National newspapers hailed Louisville as a haven of progressive race relations, a beacon of hope for a nation fearing the effects of integration. From Washington, D.C. to Minneapolis, from New York to Atlanta, Americans read of how the schools were quietly integrated in the city with the strong Southern tradition. But the image of Louisville as a progressive city constructed by Carmichael and other white leaders contrasted sharply with the reality experienced by most African Americans in the city. 3 days before the Brown decision, Andrew and Charlotte Wade, shown here, moved into their new home on Rome Court, a small working-class white neighborhood just outside the city's limits in the southwestern part of the county. The next day, they took their daughter to visit her grandmother in Louisville's West End, where most African Americans lived. And when they returned home around dusk, they found the front window of their house had been smashed in by a large rock, as you can see. The rock, which landed squarely in the family's living room, had a handwritten message wrapped around it telling them to get out. The violence did not stop there, though, and the Wades endured more hostilities throughout the night. A few hours later, Wade watched from the gaping hole in his front window as a group of 5 white men erected and burned a tall cross in a lot adjoining the black man's home. Early Sunday morning, as Wade and his family kept vigil, at least 6 shots from a .22 caliber rifle were fired directly into the kitchen, barely missing them. Finally, daylight came, and Wade left the damaged home to inform the police. Rather than intimidating Wade, the violence seemed only to make him more determined to stay in the house. He told reporters the next day, "I will never sell, not even for $150,000. I feel that as law-abiding citizens of the United States of America, we are supposed to live where we can buy." Since he could afford the house on Rome Court, he intended to live there, no matter what his neighbors did to make him vacate the residence. Wade explained, "If our neighbors do not like our being here and feel they cannot live beside us, then let them move. We intend to live here or die here." The sharp contrast between the peaceful compliance with the school desegregation and the violent reaction to integrated neighborhoods demonstrates how housing lay at the heart of racial tension in Louisville. The battle over housing erupted just as the Supreme Court handed their decision down to Brown, and for the most part the city did comply with Brown, at least on the surface, as local leaders in the Courier-Journal, which is the city's leading newspaper with a very liberal reputation, vocally supported the decision and encouraged the community to accept desegregation. While other cities closed their schools to prevent integration or sent state officials to block the doors to African American students, school integration in Louisville was fairly calm. The New York Times remarked, quote, "Black children and white children came together in Louisville without fuss or bother, almost nonchalantly." The black family's arrival on Rome Court, however, not only led to violence in the immediate neighborhood, but for many it also came to symbolize the wider struggle of the black community for better housing and economic uplift. Black Louisvillians seeking homes outside of the West End usually encountered resistance from real estate agents, lenders, and homeowners. Andrew Wade remembered, quote, "Many individuals and realtors and legal advisors advised me to buy where I was designated to buy." But Wade did not abandon his search for a home. As a veteran of the war, he believed he should be able to buy where he could afford, even if the house was in the forbidden area. When he and his wife found the ranch-style home on Rome Court in this newly developed white working-class subdivision, Wade decided to enlist some help in buying the home for his family. He asked several white people, but they openly admitted they were afraid. Finally, he decided to ask Carl and Ann Braden, a white couple known as fighters for civil rights and better conditions for people, to help him purchase the home. Here's Carl and Ann with their children, Jimmy and Anita. And here's Ann Braden with Rosa Parks. Ann Braden is very well known during this period as a civil rights activist, and actually she's one of the white Southerners who is mentioned in Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, so she's very well known. The Bradens agreed to help Wade purchase the home because, as Carl explained, they believed, quote, every man has a right to live where he wants to. Wade and the Bradens agreed that Andrew would provide $1,400 for the down payment, and then the Bradens would transfer the property to him. On May 10th, they closed on the house and then transferred the property to Wade. Ann later remembered, one man wanted the house. We were helping him get it. It seemed a small thing. However, it was not a small thing to the working class white residents on Rome Court, whose homes were much more than mere structures to them. They were symbols of their economic and racialized social status. They immediately made it known to both the Wades and the Bradens that they did not want the black family in their neighborhood. While the Wades endured physical damage to their home and racial threats in the form of a blazing cross, the Bradens endured angry phone calls. Some were anonymous threats, but others demanded they make the Wades leave. James Rohn and Ben Hudson, the realtor who had negotiated the original sale to the Bradens, led a group of angry white residents to the Bradens' home late one night. Believing the Bradens had betrayed their race, the residents shouted at Carl and threatened his children. Although the Courier-Journal did not accuse the Bradens of communism, which was a very common allegation used by many whites across the South to discredit the civil rights movement and civil rights activists, the newspaper did blame them for inciting racial tensions in the city. 2 days after the attack on the black family's home, the newspaper issued this opinion. The real fault of judgment lies with Mr. and Mrs. Carl Braden, because they purchased the home with no intention of living in it, but for the sole purpose of getting it into the hands of Negro owners. Mark Etheridge, the editor, charged that the Bradens, quote, gave poor service to idealism in forcing an issue of race relations in this artificial and contrived way. The editorial, it should be noted, came from one of the South's leading liberal newspapers, which regularly advocated racial progress, but rarely racial equality. Another editorial ran right next to this one, chastising the Bradens and the Wades. Only this one addressed the Supreme Court's decision the day before in Brown versus Board. In a flagrant act of inconsistency, the newspaper held the Brown decision as one, quote, marked by reason and restraint. Mark Etheridge encouraged his readers to support the doctrine of morality handed down by the court. Moreover, the editorial provided a brief history lesson explaining how Brown overturned the court's earlier decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that had made separate accommodations constitutional as long as they were equal. The newspaper further emphasized the point that it had been Justice John Marshall Harlan of Kentucky who had been the lone dissenter in Plessy. The editorial even reprinted snippets of Harlan's opinion, stressing one particular part, quote, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens. The Courier-Journal's tacit approval of the violent protest only made the situation worse for the Wades and signified to the entire community that neighborhood segregation was more than an issue around which working-class whites could rally. Because the local media, with the exception of the Louisville Defender, which was the city's African-American owned and operated newspaper, because the local media refused to demand justice, the police simply relaxed their investigation of the attacks on the home. The Courier-Journal had condoned the hostilities, justifying the whole incident as a matter of property rights, not civil rights. And as a result, none of the neighbors came forward with any evidence. Frankly, there was no need for them to do so. The newspaper, the city's mouthpiece, both locally and nationally, for racial progressiveness, accepted and approved of the neighbors' efforts to force the Wade family out of their home. All of these factors gave license to the perpetrators to continue their fight to make the Wades move, and they did not hesitate. At the end of June, when the authorities still had not made any arrests for the events of the month before, a group of angry whites bombed the home. The explosives had been placed in a ventilation hole almost directly under the bathroom, destroying the tile floor and blowing up the bottom of a metal tub. The powerful blast of dynamite also ripped stone veneer from the outside walls, practically demolished 2 bedrooms, and shattered 5 windows in the home. Wade estimated the damage between $5,000 and $7,000. According to Police Captain Carlos Johns, only the Wades and the police officer patrolling the area reported hearing the explosion. The neighbors told the police they hadn't heard the blast, which frankly I find interesting given the fact that here's a cute little neighbor's home right over here. So it seems as if they're close enough in the frame, perhaps someone other than the Wades would have heard this. A little suspicious. The bombing on Rome Court obliterated the facade of peaceful race relations in Louisville and divided the community along racial lines. The Wade Defense Committee, an ad hoc committee organized by local blacks to help the Wades live in their home peacefully, demanded that the FBI come to the city and bring the perpetrators to justice. The Louisville Defender, which was the black newspaper, already knew where to place the blame and boldly announced it on the front page. Segregationists have run rampant against the Wades. It was easy for the forces of hate to stoop to bombing in an atmosphere of total resentment, aided and abetted by indifferent policing, anti-press, and belligerent whites. Although the Courier-Journal managed to express some sympathy for the Wades, Mark Etheridge, the editor, seemed to be more concerned about how the criminal activity would affect the city's image and assumed a "we told you so" attitude about the whole situation. He wrote, "We regretted at the time their decision was made to challenge the prejudices of white neighbors who would not welcome them. It had been our hope that the problems of racial integration in Louisville would never bring the sort of corrosive violence that afflicts other communities. That hope is disappointed." In October, both Carl and Ann Braden and 5 other whites were charged with conspiring to dynamite the house for seditious purposes. It only took a few days for the all-white jury to return a guilty conviction for Carl. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Ultimately, he only served 8 months and paid a fine because the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his sentence, and Ann's case actually never went to trial after that. The conviction, however, eased the white community's conscience, and the city leaders quickly resumed promoting Louisville as a place of racial progress. Liberal and moderate whites repackaged the whole ordeal as the work of subversives rather than local blacks. Indeed, the conviction enabled whites to justify Wade's behavior as the work of radical incendiaries, rather than the result of Wade's own frustration with the housing situation. Many whites viewed local blacks just as their ancestors had, as happy and contented subordinates in their community. By pointing the finger at the Bradens, they could continue to do so. The Bradens' conviction also protected the city's racially progressive image by blaming the Red Menace rather than the lack of adequate housing for African Americans as the root of racial tension in the city. In this city that prided itself on its peaceful race relations, white Louisvillians could easily tolerate communists lurking in their community. It was quite another matter, however, to host discontented African Americans. As Ann Braden put it, white Louisville went home to its beds that night to sleep quietly. Its duty done, its heart cleansed, its evil exorcised. The Wade incident resolved in the minds of many whites. Local leaders seized on the city's success at school integration and vigorously promoted Louisville as a place of racial tolerance. Indeed, the success of school integration had catapulted the city into national and international prominence. The national media regularly congratulated the city for its peaceful compliance and described to readers across the nation the city's unmatched progress in race relations. After Eisenhower's laudatory comments Superintendent Carmichael went on a national speaking tour, which included a stop at Harvard University, where he was awarded an honorary degree. The federal government relied on Louisville's desegregation to help win the war against communism around the world. The United States Information Agency published reports and pamphlets detailing the peaceful process of integration in Louisville to combat the negative image of the nation's race relations provided by other cities, especially Little Rock. Although the city's leaders promoted Louisville's desegregation as a way to deflect attention away from the housing situation, African Americans understood that school integration would not bring about substantive changes in their socioeconomic situation, particularly if current housing policies and patterns were maintained. The Wade Defense Committee boldly asserted that, quote, "The end of school segregation will mean little if housing remains segregated." Indeed, despite legal desegregation in 1956, residential segregation and school availability kept many black and white students from learning together. A transfer option conveniently allowed parents to move their children out of undesirable schools into the schools of their choice. In fact, while Louisville basked in the glory of its school desegregation, and Elmer Carmichael advised President Eisenhower on how to successfully implement the court's decision, less than 3,000 of the school system's 12,500 black students were enrolled in white schools during that first year of integration. The next year saw little improvement, and many schools were far from integrated. Despite claims by Carmichael and other school officials that classrooms would in fact be more racially mixed than the previous year. To give you an example, on September 29th of 1957, 900 white students attended one high school in the eastern part of the city. No African American students took classes there. Conversely, at Central High School, which is the largest black high school in the West End, the opposite was the case. Over 1,000 black students were attended there, while no whites went to school there. The Newburgh School, which had been built only a few years before the Brown decision in order to accommodate the growing number of black students who could not attend the white schools, continued to have a single-race student body after the city implemented its integration plan. The school had 9 grades, all of which consisted of all African American students. In his explanation of Newburgh's monochrome racial composition, a county official acknowledged the relationship between residential segregation and school integration. Quote, "Well, anybody in the Newburgh School District is eligible to go to the school. It just so happens that no white families with children live there." But rather than remedy the housing patterns that maintain segregation in all other public venues, local whites continued instead to tirelessly promote Louisville's race relations on the national and international scene. In an interview for an article in U.S. News & World Report on the Supreme Court's decision in Brown and its implementation in Louisville, Courier-Journal editor Mark Etheridge claimed that Louisville was simply unlike other places in the South. He boasted of the calm desegregation of the University of Louisville in 1950 and spoke of the, quote, "great many other advances made here, a good deal of lifting of segregation in transportation and public meeting places." As he described the city's peaceful and willing compliance to the court's decision to the National magazine, Etheridge pointed out that Louisville schools had partially desegregated without trouble and predicted future accomplishments. Quote, "The public school system here has announced full integration as of next September, both in city and county schools." No mention was made, however, of the turbulence in Louisville caused by attempts to integrate the city's neighborhoods. Although local whites may have been successful at selling the city's progressive image to the rest of the nation, Louisville's African American community knew this image masked a deep-seated structural racism that relegated them to the west end of the city. Throughout the 1960s, African Americans challenged whites to make good on their progressive rhetoric and open their neighborhoods to people of color. The housing conflict reached its zenith in the spring of 1967, with 2 months of nightly demonstrations, pickets, boycotts, and racial violence. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to the city to lead marches, stationing several of his key SCLC organizers there, and Louisville's own Muhammad Ali returned to join the struggle, telling the world that he would not fight communism abroad while his people at home were denied full equality. This decision would ultimately cost him his championship title. In the wake of these open housing protests, the New Republic frankly questioned the city's long-celebrated reputation. One columnist wrote, quote, "What happened in Louisville in the past year before an open housing ordinance cast some doubt on how much racial attitudes have changed in a half-century. Despite Louisville's image, it was no paradise of tolerance." Indeed, Louisville's liberal elite, especially the Courier Journal, called for an immediate solution to the housing conflict, not because of a genuine concern over human rights, but because of a genuine concern over Louisville's national image as a place of progressive race relations. And let's see, here's some slides of just random protests. This is downtown in the city of Louisville. Here's Muhammad Ali. This is in 1963, before he comes back in 67, but here he is with a group of fans. This is in the southwestern part of the city, and they are marching through. This looks fairly peaceful here, but in 1967, things get a little bit out of hand, and folks start getting increasingly violent. Not the protesters, but the folks watching. We'll get to this. In the end, the battle over where African Americans could live gained the nation's attention, and the reality of residential segregation exposed the city's progressive image for what it was. Segregated housing patterns also undermined Louisville's token school desegregation efforts. In 1975, white demonstrators took to the streets to protest forced student busing, a problem ostensibly about education, but at heart about housing. Despite the city's bold claims in the 1950s that Louisville schools were desegregated, informal and institutional housing discrimination have maintained segregation in most public schools. In fact, out of 67 schools in the city system, 27 had a 90% white majority, and 24 had a 90% African American majority. In order to solve the problem and create mixed-race classrooms, the court ordered students to be transported into other districts. Protests escalated with 50 injuries and almost 200 arrests. But as Morris Rabb of the NAACP explained, there wouldn't be any problem if we had open housing because there would be blacks living where whites were living. In short, Rabb argued, and correctly so, if neighborhoods were integrated, it wouldn't be necessary to bus students. And here's some images from these protests during court-ordered busing. They get pretty violent. I love how bored the policemen look. Just whatever, doing their thing. This is obviously the KKK is protesting busing at the Jefferson County Board of Education. The KKK makes several appearances in Louisville during this period, and city leaders are often trying to get the KKK to leave, get out of the city, because they're very concerned about what the president said that the KKK is going to do for their national image. Rightly so, I would say. After 2 days of demonstrations, state and local police were unable to restore order. So Governor Julian Carroll dispatched 800 National Guardsmen on September 7th to tame a crowd of 2,500 white anti-busing demonstrators in the southwestern part of the county, near the area where Andrew Wade had originally tried to buy his home. The centrality of housing to the protest quickly became obvious. During the hearings to mediate the situation, William Kellerman, president of the Citizens Against Busing, openly told the United States Commission on Civil Rights, children are simply being bused because of housing patterns in this community. Yet Kellerman and others like him refused to admit that African Americans could not find housing outside of the West End. An African American minister named Reverend Walter Stitt offered a different explanation. Quote, "Out in my neighborhood, we have had a cross burned in the yard of a black family and people shooting through the windows. A family on our street put their house up for sale a few years ago, and when a black family showed up to buy, they jacked the price way up." In short, individual and institutionalized discrimination maintained residential segregation in the city, as African Americans lived mostly in the West End and whites lived everywhere else. 30 years after the busing controversy and over 50 years after the city received presidential praise and international acclaim for school integration, Louisville's desegregation plan gained national attention again in 2006. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments on the constitutionality of the school board's policy, which used race as a factor in pupil placement. The case came from a plaintiff who claimed her son was unconstitutionally denied equal protection because he was refused admission to the public school in his neighborhood because he is white. The school board argued that in order to comply with Brown v. Board of Education and the 1973 federal court order to fully integrated schools, race must be one of the factors under consideration. The Supreme Court disagreed, however. In a 5-4 ruling, the court concluded that the school board's plan violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In the plurality opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that the school board offered no evidence that alternative plans to achieve diversity were considered and provided no pedagogical justification for the racial consideration plan. Moreover, the plan violated the decision in Brown v. Board of Education because it used race to determine pupil placement. In a strongly worded dissent, Justice Stephen Breyer summed up the plurality's opinion stating, quote, "This is a decision that the court and the nation will come to regret." Just as it had done in 1954, local officials in Louisville quickly went about the task of compliance last fall. The new plan uses geographical areas based equally on the income, educational levels, and race of residents. Because it does not directly take into account the race of students, the school board approved the new plan earlier this year. It has already withstood several legal challenges, and barring any future legal challenges, this upcoming fall, students in Louisville will be assigned to schools on the basis of this new plan. Yet housing patterns in the city remain largely unchanged, even after the passage of local, state, and federal laws designed to eradicate discrimination and open neighborhoods to people of color. Louisville remains starkly divided by race. Reports from the 2000 census confirm that African Americans remain predominantly in the West End, while whites live everywhere else. A study in 2002 by the Brookings Institution ranked Louisville the 52nd most segregated metropolitan area out of 272 cities across the nation. In the end, the Wade incident, the Brown decision, the busing controversy of the 1970s, the school desegregation case recently decided by the Supreme Court, and the current efforts of school officials to achieve racial balance in a racially divided city demonstrates the intimate relationship between residential segregation and school integration. Whites from all income levels had a social, material, and psychological investment in their homes, and they united to protect their neighborhoods from African Americans. Indeed, whites from all economic backgrounds rallied around the issue of housing, determined to maintain residential segregation at all costs. They understood that school desegregation would have little effect if neighborhoods weren't desegregated at the same time. Their neighborhoods then represented, frankly, the last bastion of white supremacy. As a result, African Americans were moved to the West End to live in substandard housing, away from viable employment opportunities and quality schools. African Americans, however, challenged the individual and institutional racism that prevented them from living where they chose. Ultimately, though, residential segregation was so entrenched in Louisville that in spite of their efforts, a color line continues to divide the city's neighborhoods and its schools. This scenario was repeated over and over in cities all across the nation, as whites barred blacks from certain neighborhoods and trapped them in ramshackle housing in economically disadvantaged locations. In the 1970s, James Baldwin explained to sociologist Margaret Mead the process by which the black ghetto had been created. Quote, It is not being done by accident. It is not something like an act of God. It is something that has been done deliberately and is being done deliberately. Although Baldwin spoke in generalities, he accurately described the making of modern Louisville and many other cities across the United States. For although local whites in Louisville promoted a policy of racial justice and economic opportunity for all citizens, they practiced a policy of racial discrimination and economic oppression. This policy not only affected where African Americans lived, but also where they attended school. And it is the legacy of this policy that Louisvillians, and in fact all Americans, are struggling to understand and overcome today. Thank you.
I don't know, did you say where were the waves when the bomb went off? Were they in the house?
They were in the house.
And
No, they weren't in the house during that time. They had gone out, actually, for the night. But there were people there guarding the house. So the Wades weren't there, but they had, through this Wade Defense Committee that had been set up, they had people stationed at the home to kind of keep track, keep tabs, and make sure nothing happened to the home. So there were 2 people that were inside the home at the time. They were not injured. But the Wades were actually, again, visiting his parents in the West End.
And how did it happen that, what was the evidence ostensibly that the, I forgot their name already.
Oh, the Braden?
The Braden, yeah.
The interesting thing about it is there is really no evidence. As soon as the prosecutor begins investigating, it becomes very clear that this is going to become an issue of communism. Very clear. And he makes it very clear, uses as evidence for this sort of sedition charge their past work with the Progressive Party, their work within the community with civil rights, and uses that to brand them as communists very early on. So only really the black community and sympathizers, and there are a few white sympathizers with the Bradens in 1950s Louisville, are even asking, demanding for further concrete evidence. But there is no evidence, and they don't really, after the trial and after Braden, after the Supreme Court overturns the verdict, there is no further investigation. So no one actually knows who bombed the home.
And were they actually affiliated with the Communist Party at all?
Carl had flirted with the Communist Party, but he was not like a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. But they had flirted, but they were very active in Henry Wallace's Progressive Party run, and they were very active in sort of liberal politics that many people in Louisville found just a little bit dangerous.
Why did you not mention the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 65, and 68? Because they are extremely important and relevant, especially to the housing issue that, like you brought out, it still exists today.
You're exactly right. And part of the reason that I didn't mention those 3 acts, Kentucky actually becomes one of the first states, particularly as a southern state, because Kentucky always identifies itself as a southern state, even though most southern states kind of look at us a little askance when we do that. But Kentucky is actually one of those first southern states that passes a fair housing law. And it does so in 1964, right before the Civil Rights Act is passed, and then the Voting Rights Act in 68. So part of the reason I didn't mention it is simply a factor of time. Part of the reason I didn't mention it is because I really don't see the effect of those laws trickling down as directly as I wish they would have, and perhaps the activists that I'm speaking of wish they would have as well. Because what happens is these homeowners simply find other ways to circumvent these laws, right? And so these laws are important for a number of reasons in that they're passed, but as far as on the ground, many, at least in my community, the one that I'm studying, but I would argue that across the nation, are still struggling to get out of these prescribed areas for people of color, despite the passage of these laws.
So it was black students that were put on buses to go to white schools, correct?
By and large,
Okay.
it is.
So I can only imagine that because like white students living in their white houses, obviously,
Right.
with the white mentality and white
Right.
supremacy. So I would be a little concerned, like as if I were a black parent,
Sure.
putting my child on a bus
Sure.
and being taken to a white school.
Sure.
It's most likely going to be hostile, negative in the
Sure.
classroom itself.
Sure.
So how really were parents on board and being able, like, yeah, you want to have equal rights,
Sure.
you want to be desegregated, but really it all comes down to also protecting your child and putting your child in that negative
Right.
environment. So
Right.
how really were they on board for that?
Right. Well, what happens in Louisville is at first, African American parents are a little bit skeptical about busing, but they feel like it's going to be okay because they were promised, well, white students were going to be bused too. Now, busing becomes sort of a class issue because by and large it is working class white families that are enduring busing as well. So it's working class white families and then African American families. Once it becomes obvious in Louisville that most of the students who are being bused are black students, African American parents begin protesting and saying, hey, you know, this needs to be a little bit more equitable because our children are being forced to endure very violent conditions. You know, you saw the school buses that have been caught on fire. So they begin protesting that as well. But they're protesting that it's more equitable, whereas white working class parents are protesting, we don't want this at all. So they both begin protesting busing, but they have very different arguments about it.
I was just wondering, because you talked about how, Louisville had this, they wanted to advance this image of the city as being more progressive than other cities in the South. But I was wondering what you thought of the comparison then. I mean, how different was Louisville from, or how similar was Louisville from other southern cities? I was curious to know, for example, it's a minority black city by quite a large margin.
Yes.
So is it one of the whiter, large southern cities?
I think it is one of the whiter, large southern cities. And as far as in comparison, I'll answer that sort of in two parts. Louisville is very much aware of what is happening in other southern cities, particularly Atlanta. Atlanta is always on their mind. They are constantly thinking about Atlanta, what economic development Atlanta is getting in response to them. Now, I think Louisville is progressive in different ways than Atlanta, but very similar things are happening. So, whereas in Atlanta, more of a deep south southern city, you know, things are a little bit more, what's the word I want? More overt. It's more of an overt racism. Whereas in Louisville, it is very polite and very subtle. So they will say, and they say this very openly, sure, voting rights, totally, you can have voting rights. They desegregate restaurants, public spaces. It takes a fight, but they do it very openly, and finally everybody's okay with it. So things happen at a different pace. It's more sort of a structural racism that's happening in Louisville, in which they're very concerned about keeping African Americans in their place, and they will give them token integration as long as it makes the community look good, the white community look good. So it is progressive, but things are happening at a different pace in Louisville. Change is happening at a very different pace.
I had a follow-up too.
Yes.
You had a map there with, now, is it true that during this time, I think this kind of happens in Atlanta, do the freeways or do the, does that box these blacks in? Is that, it
Yeah.
kind of happens in Atlanta?
We'll go back here. Yes, it's very similar. It's very similar. So in the 1960s, when urban renewal comes in and federal policies are being passed to sort of spruce up the city, most African Americans are living right here to over here. They're starting this movement over. But still, the poorest African Americans live in this central part. Now, when the freeway comes in, you will see this big green snaky thing. This is most of these people are then displaced and moved over here. Now, what they want to do is they want to build a separate freeway. They want it a little bit further over here so that they can trap, I think, and they talk about this in documents, city planners talk about, oh, well, if we move it further west, this will further sort of keep African Americans from moving out. They also are very excited. See this loop around the city? What they want to do is they want it to be somewhere along over here. Okay? And they call this the North-South Expressway Loop or something along those lines. Now, those plans get derailed because African Americans say, no. We don't want this at all. So instead, what they eventually have done is built a large two-lane highway that runs right here. It's hard to see it on this map right here. That is now known as Roy Wilkins Boulevard, which is quite comical since he was a very prominent civil rights figure. But yeah, so the freeways really, and because of the river, it becomes the river and the freeways there essentially trapped. And then all of this is like industrial areas. What happens is this, the river floods in 1937, and it's a terrible disaster for the city, still suffering the effects of the Great Depression. And this area, before the 37 flood, had been primarily an exclusive white middle class neighborhood. And after the flood, they say, no thanks, we don't want to go back there. And World War II delays plans for the construction of a flood wall, and so local realtors and banking institutions and civic leaders say, well, this area would be perfect for African Americans, so they begin opening this area to them. So, yeah, just.
I have a question. When I-65 went through, did they like specifically try to target the black communities to displace them further west, or like when they snake, how it's all snaking there, did they like try and go through black communities rather than white communities?
It was deliberately done in this area because they felt like, well, these are slums anyway, so we need to get rid of these areas. And conveniently enough, that's going to be easy because these are slums. We can cast it off as, well, these are slum areas. They need to be redeveloped. We'll just put the highway in. And often what they'll do is they'll say, we will help you find a place to live. However, it has to be in this area. And they'll say, and if you don't allow us to help you find a place to live, particularly in this area, we will give you no displacement money, because they would sometimes offer a little bit of money to these people. So, but yeah, I mean, it was done deliberately in that area, targeting.
Yeah, did I understand you correctly to suggest that the 2006 Supreme Court decision suggesting that we couldn't take race into account in assigning children to schools was itself a racist decision?
I am suggesting that the decision is flawed in that it is unaware of, not just in Louisville, but in the city that was paired with Louisville in the Supreme Court decision, Seattle, and other cities across the country, that housing segregation remains such a problem that if we are thinking about where we are going to send children to schools, that we need to consider where people live in order to do that. And unfortunately, in most places, whites live one area and people of color live another area. So in order to have integrated neighborhood schools, logically it seems to me you would need to have integrated neighborhoods. So I'm not calling the decision racist. I just think it's flawed and does not reflect an understanding of the lived realities of people in these cities. Yeah.
Well, just to continue that point, and I was going to ask the similar question about what's happening today, because in my experience, and I've actually lived in the South and Southern California and on the East Coast, and in Northern California as well, or Central California, and in every single place I've lived, the demographics you describe hold. There's always, if you look where the houses are nice and the streets are clean, it's white people, and then you look where there's kind of shabby little apartments or maybe bungalows, and it's never any other way. And so then you might ask, well, is the Supreme Court really that benighted that they cannot understand the lived realities? I mean, doesn't that really amount to racism? I think it does.
I have mixed feelings about the current Supreme Court anyway. Very mixed feelings about the current Supreme Court. But I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it was a 5-4 decision, which does not represent a clear majority, obviously. So then we have to take into account, well, there are certain justices that do seem to think, well, we need to look at the history of housing segregation in relation to school integration. So I will not damn the entire court because of this decision. Now, do I think it is a racist decision? I think it is an ignorant decision that they did not take into account. They were too wedded to using Brown as legal precedent to take into account not only the histories of American cities and modern development post-World War II, but also other legal precedent, which clearly states that it's okay to use race as long as you're trying to achieve integration. You can't exclude people on the basis of race, because in order to create an exclusionary situation. But it is acceptable legally. The legal precedent is very clear that it is acceptable to use race if you are trying to have an inclusive environment. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but
Yeah, I mean, I guess the charge is difficult, but it also seems from the story that you told today that this kind of intentional, what you say, wedded to only looking at one thing, in other words, narrow-mindedness or blindness, is a way of covering over what is essentially a racist move.
and I think what they're doing too is covering over the American past, and they are not mindful of, well, how did we get to where we are today? And as James Baldwin says, well, it's not an accident. It's not an act of God. It's not because people choose to live in, floodplains and environmentally unsound areas. It's not like people sign up to say, okay, well, I'd love to live over there. It was being done deliberately, and I think because of structures of inequality that still exist, and now I'm getting a little too theoretical, but I think it's still present and it's still happening. And I think that perhaps now maybe it's not being as done deliberately as in James Baldwin's 1970 America. Perhaps we're in this post-civil rights moment, but I think being in this post-civil rights moment obscures the reality that these conditions still exist. This is still prevalent, and this is still a problem. And it is unfortunate for me, as I eagerly awaited the Supreme Court's decision, but I knew that the Supreme Court was going to decide. I was not shocked by this, but it is unfortunate that this is the way the Supreme Court decided, because it does seem to be a lot ignorant about the presence of race, not only in today's society, but in the American past. It seems to be.
What happened to the Wades 10, 15, 20 years later?
Eventually they moved back to Louisville. They did not live in the house. And I contacted Andrew Wade in 2006. I think I sent him a very nice letter asking him if he would be willing to talk about this with me. And he called me and politely said, I've tried to forget about this. I don't want to have, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't. It's in the past, and I don't want to think about it again. But they remained in the city.
And in which neighborhood in the city?
They were forced then to move back to the West End. And I think they actually lived in the neighborhood where Carl and Braden lived, because Carl and Braden lived in the West End. And they remained there until she died in 2006.
So I also was wondering then if have some things changed for some blacks? Have some blacks been able to move out?
Yeah.
Or
You'll see in the city, these are still large pockets of African Americans. And throughout the 70s, 80s, middle class professionals, upper class African Americans are moving out. Moving into these areas here, some are, few are moving into these areas because there's still lingering resentment. But some are moving into these areas, some are moving farther out, some are moving into southern Indiana, and moving over here. This area up here is known as the Highlands. This is still predominantly very wealthy elites who live over here. But yeah, so there are things that have changed. This is mostly lower middle class, lower income African Americans. There are some who have moved out, definitely. But when I teach in Kentucky and I talk about the Bradens and I talk about this and I have students from Louisville, I'll ask them just off the cuff, so where do most white folks live? And they're all like, oh, well, Dr. Blum, of course they live in the West End. Of course they live in the East End. And I'll say, well, then where do African Americans live? Well, don't you know? They live in the West End. And I'll say, well, why? Well, because they want to. So, which strikes me, and I'll say, well, do you want to live in the West End? Well, no, I wouldn't want to live in the West End. But, yeah. It was common knowledge, it still is common knowledge. And they openly talk about it. The Career Journal is constantly talking about, how African Americans need to be very respectful of gangs. they've received, and only, if they're peaceful and tolerant will they be able to move out of these areas. And they'll say, well, everybody knows that African Americans can't live in the East End, so it's very open discussions. They're very frank about it.
What do your white students say when you tell them the history, when you try to explain it?
They're shocked, frankly.
So you are doing a service.
Yes. I try very hard. They're shocked, and a lot of times when I ask them, well, would you like to live in the West End, and they'll say no, and we talk about, well, why wouldn't you? And then well, why do you think people of color want to live there? Then it becomes, oh, well, maybe they don't. So then we have to talk about these forces that, first of all, why is it the West End that African Americans live and not the East End? What is it about this area? And then we have to talk about, well, how did they come to be there? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, most African Americans, middle class, and poor blacks lived in this central part. So over the 20th century, it becomes more racially divided. So then in 2000, the city is more segregated than it was in 1900. Way more segregated. Yeah, way more segregated. Yeah.
So is there like a different version of American history that's being taught in the South that they just really can't?
That's a very
there. So
that's a very
like
good
I
question.
cannot even wrap my brain around that. Like, just how is that still okay? How is it still like, hey, well, you guys live over there in the slums, and we live over here, and everyone's fine. We're all child. Like, how is that?
It's not like it's still okay. I think it's just that's the way it is. It's just like that's the way it is. Yeah.
Relevant to her question, yes, there are differences. There is a very strong Christian right movement from Texas out that they have for the last 30 years. The family, it's a husband and wife, they've just died, both of them. A very, very strong Republican Christian right organization, foundation that they created. In fact, I mentioned in my paper that they have accomplished tyrannizing textbook publishers over the past 30 years, and because of their power economically and the Christian right force becoming so powerful in this area, they have forced and only use in all of the public schools or whatever schools in the South, actually they push the books all through the nation, but especially in the area that you're covering and all of the South, books that do not show or explain history as showing the black as a victim, and that whites are not shown as brutal, heartless beings. And it goes on and on and on, the way they have accomplished the text being modified. So yes, oh yeah, they are taught in many schools differently than what you would get in a very objectively taught school. Yeah.
Definitely. And I would say as a product
Recently. Right
sure.
now.
And I'd say as a product of education in Kentucky, where our motto is education pays.
Isn't that morally wrong to kind of like tweak history so it comes out to your
but
favor?
then it becomes the theoretical question of, well, what is history, right? I mean, history is subjective, right? I mean, there is no single truth. And so people, there are lots of people, not lots, couple, people who are questioning, who are dealing with Louisville and asking very similar questions than I am about the city. And they're coming up with very different interpretations about what's going on in the city. So, history then is very subjective. So as far as it being a moral question, I would like to say, well, yes, of course, how could they not? But it happens. It does happen. Nancy.
I would have to say that the South's different version of history predates the vast right-wing conspiracy by hundreds of years. And right, absolutely. I grew up in LA, and then our family lived in Charleston, South Carolina for 3 years, just at the time that our daughter was starting kindergarten. And so this was an education for Nancy to deal with Charleston, South Carolina's version of the world, and a local history class that I took in the 70s emphasized the benevolence of slave owners and how, this was in the late 70s even, how, of course, slave owners didn't mistreat their slaves because that would not have made economic sense. This was the prevailing mindset in the 30s, or in the 70s, excuse me. And so it's just, I think the emphasis on tradition, I think you're right. It's just the way it is. And it's always been that way, and so that is very much the way it is.
Sure. And I would ask, faculty members at the University of Kentucky when I was just doing early research, and I would tell them what I was working on, and they would say, well, I'm not really sure if that's a historical question, Sarah. And I said, well, why not? Well, because they live there because they choose to live there, so I'm not really sure what you're investigating. That's what I'm investigating right there. So, I mean, yeah, it's not just, secondary, not to trash on Kentucky schools or whatnot, but to just say it is a different mindset. It is a different mindset. And as historians, right, we all have different interpretations anyway. But yeah, it's a different mindset. It is different. Yeah.
But aren't these issues, are all, before we trash this out, aren't these issues, these are national problems?
Sure.
And I was going to ask you, how much better is San Diego than Louisville when it comes to racial ghettos, or LA, or some of the others? I mean, can you make a
I'm going to have to say, to be honest, I know very little about San Diego, being a recent arrivee myself. What I do know about this is happening all over. This isn't just a southern problem. This is happening in Oakland. This is happening in Seattle. This is happening in Chicago, in Detroit. This is all over Kansas City. So it's not just a southern problem. It's not just, because southerners, we're still fighting the Civil War and we're backward and we don't get it. This is a national issue, particularly issues of housing. It's a national problem. Yeah. And Louisville, I think, reflects this national trend.
Isn't this more of an economic question because of, it's a floodplain, so the land's going to be cheaper. Over here, it's a nicer area.
Sure.
The houses are nicer. It's going to be more
Sure.
expensive.
Sure.
So, isn't that really the root of the problem? Granted, before, totally.
No.
But that, in present day, isn't it more economics?
I think that's an excellent question, Chris. An excellent question. And in my larger work, I talk about how it is rooted in economics. And how, where people choose to live, the question of choice is often rooted in where they can afford to live, right? So then it becomes an issue of economic discrimination. And I think the two of them are rooted together. Because you're right, this is on a floodplain, so they're not going to develop here. So they develop in other places, but African Americans can't afford to go to those places. They can't live near where they were. They have very little transportation opportunities during this period to get to these sort of outer areas to work. So yeah, I think it's all tied together. Yeah, definitely. Excellent. Oh yeah, Chris.
I was going to say, to kind of tag onto that point, it also depends on what type of jobs you can get.
Sure.
Because also, if you're not going to get jobs in the areas where the nicer homes are, you're going to have to live close because you can't afford to commute.
Sure.
So also,
Sure.
as long as economic, it's social in that you are very limited.
Oh yeah, and the National Urban League does a study in Louisville in the 1960s, and is trying to recruit black professionals to the city. And it is very successful in recruiting like 10 to 15 African American professionals to the city, who leave after 3 weeks because they cannot find a place to live. There's no place. Because not only is it that African Americans are denied housing in these other areas, Louisville, like most cities after World War II, is facing a very severe housing crisis. So there's not enough housing. So the housing that is available for African Americans often isn't very good. And so these black professionals say, we're done, we're out of here, and they go somewhere else. In fact, I think they go to Atlanta.
I have no idea about kind of the demographics, but I was wondering, I assume there's some migration maybe.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit outside the kind of black and white
Sure.
divide, if there are other ethnic groups now perhaps
Yes.
playing any role there?
Yes, there are. There is actually have the numbers of that because I anticipated a question on that. Yes, primarily in the city, it still is composed of a sort of black-white binary. There's racial composition. There has been at least, as reports from like the 1990 census and the 2000 census, an influx of immigrants, primarily Hispanic immigrants, coming into the city. Now, where they're living, I don't know, to be honest with you. I've been so mired in my own creation of this binary that I haven't looked to see where they're living necessarily. But there has been a large number of Hispanic immigrants into the city. But not as much as you would think. I was expecting great deals, but I mean, it wasn't as much as, it's still a very small percentage. Now, into the state, we have a large number of Hispanic immigrants, but that's primarily farm, agriculture, and whatnot. And in the county, too, in the southwestern part of the county.
In that case, let me ask one.
Sure.
Because I've been thinking, you're going to go to New Orleans, and
Yes.
you're going to expand on this talk,
Yeah.
and that'll be in the post-Katrina era. And of course, it's probably coincidence that it happens to be New Orleans. But I'm just curious if you plan to build some reference into your talk, or if you expect a reaction. And of course, most people who come to your talk, they're not going to be from New Orleans, because that's where conferences are.
Right.
But you might still get some local people who will have some sense of comparison. Have you thought of building in a kind of comparison?
That's a very good idea. I have not. Now that makes me nervous, though, because I think I perhaps should. That's a very good idea. Part of the talk is actually part of a panel in which me and two other scholars, one from University of Washington, one from Emory, we put together to talk about border states. So one of my colleagues is doing Louisville as well, but then another one was doing Baltimore. So we've been thinking about, the idea is, what happens in these border states is that these leaders use their southernness, the fact that they're southern cities, they call themselves southern cities, and Louisville is the self-proclaimed gateway to the South after 1940, to sort of impede further civil rights progress. So to say, well, you got it better here, and we're a southern city, than in places like Atlanta. And they're always thanking God for Mississippi. That, well, we're not as bad as Mississippi, so everything's good. But that would be a good thought to sort of offer some comparison in Louisville and New Orleans. That's a very, I should do that. Just to be prepared. Because I haven't, I thought about when I was finishing up the dissertation for the PhD is when Katrina happened. And so I was sort of writing the last chapter while all of this was happening and just thinking, wow, all of this means so much. It was sort of reaffirming the fact that I think this matters to people and this is still happening today.
It's still happening.
And this is still affecting people's lives. And what happens in Louisville, it happens across the nation. So I think I should probably do that.
And probably similarities and differences.
Yeah.
Because it's
Definitely.
really not the same situation.
Oh yeah, exactly. But some interesting comparisons I think could be made. So it's a good, I need to do that. Make a note of that.
Do you have any more questions? In that case, I want to thank Professor